Hey everyone. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Latin verb endings. So again, kind of like what we did with nouns, it's a big topic, an important topic, but we're just going to do a quick intro here, kind of give you the basics so you can understand what's going on. So the first question I want to ask you, what is a verb, right? It seems really straightforward and again, kind of an easy question like what is a noun, but maybe you never stop to think about it. A verb is an action word, right? It's verbs like running, jumping, climbing, or even raining, right? The four images you see here. It's something that has to do with an action. That's what we call verbs, right? So just make sure you have that straight. Hopefully you remember it from, like grade school. But it's an important question, one that you need to be able to answer in order to move forward. So just a quick side note here, a verb doesn't have to be a physical action. So I think this is something that often confuses my students, particularly when they're starting their Latin career. And I say to them, hey, what's a verb? They're not expecting me to say, what type of word is to think. And they're like, wait, what? Is it a verb? Is it not? Right? It doesn't have to be physical. The physical ones are ones we can all kind of identify. Run, jump, walk, that all makes sense. The mental ones, though, you got to keep track of too. Thinking, believing, those are verbs. And even ones that are more like a state or a condition, right? The verb to be, right? I am something is a verb. Feeling something, right? That's not really physical or mental. It's more emotional, right? If you want to think of it that way. Feeling is a verb. And sleeping, right? What are you doing when you're sleeping? Well, you're not really awake or doing anything actively. So it's more passive, but it is a verb, right? So that's important to think of too. It's not just, just physical things. It can be a little bit more than that. They're all verbs. So if you can keep that in mind, hopefully you feel pretty comfortable with it. And words like to type, to launch, these are things that we all know, right? And we can recognize pretty straightforward. But just make sure, like I said, you're always keeping track of the mental ones, those state or conditions. So whenever you go through English or Latin, right? Particularly we're dealing with Latin here, but when you run into words, you want to be able to explain and identify what verbs are. It's really important. It's not something that you probably think about too much, but you want to make sure that you have that kind of solid foundation before we move forward. So in Latin, right, verbs have a couple different aspects to them. The most important ones, tense, mood, and voice. So these are things we're going to talk about in later videos because we're really focusing on endings here and the basics of it. But when you talk about a Latin verb, you can change the tense around. When did it happen, right? Is it present tense, past tense, future? What's going on? The mood is another thing that's a little tricky to unpack, but we can, in a later video, we'll talk about it. Is it indicative? Are you telling me something like a fact right now? Is it subjunctive? Is it imperative? Are you commanding me to do something? These are all different parts of a verb that we need to unpack as you go through your Latin career. For now, just, identify this, hear it, make sure you understand it a little bit. You don't have to go too nuts with it. Voice is it active or passive, right? Is the subject doing something or is something happening to it is kind of the idea. We'll deal with all of this later, but there are important elements to verbs that change the ending. And that's kind of the key thing here. Depending on your tense, your mood, or your voice, the verb is going to be spelled differently. So we're not going to deal with them in this video, but we will deal with them later on because it's really important to understand so that you know how to spell your Latin verb. Which brings us to this slide. How do they actually work? It's all about endings, right? And this is the key thing you want to write down, process, remember, memorize, whatever you got to do. The spelling of a Latin verb changes depending on who or what the subject is. So in other words, who or what is doing the action. So if I wanted to say I'm running, that's different than saying you're running, right? In English, not so much. In Latin, I would have to change the spelling of my verb. So that's a big difference when you're talking between English or Latin. In English, we use pronouns and nouns to tell you who the subject is. So you might use the pronouns I, you, he, she, it, we, you, all, or they, right? The spelling doesn't really change. So you're saying I walk, you walk. We spelled the word walk the same. It didn't matter if I was doing it or you were doing it. In Latin, you have to change the spelling of the verb, and that's the really tricky part to understand and wrap your head around. So it's important that you do it early on in your Latin career. You change the spelling of your verb to say who the subject is. You also do it when you're dealing with different tense and mood and voice, like I said. But in terms of what we're covering in this video, change the ending and you're changing the meaning. That's really what we're getting at. So don't freak out, right? Fun fact for you, you actually know how to do this. If you speak English, you know how to do this. You've probably never thought about it, but we actually change the ending of our verbs too. It only really happens one time though. It's in that third person singular, the he, she, it form of a verb. So maybe you never noticed, but you would say I walk, you walk, and he, she, it walks, right? That S ending is a leftover in English of putting different endings on verbs depending on who the subject is, right? So we've almost completely eliminated this because if you kept going, you'd say we walk, you all walk, they walk. We're not changing anything. But there still is that one little tricky spot in the third person singular, which is why it's really common for people, for whom English is not their first language. They stumble a little bit on this because it doesn't make sense, right? Why are we changing one ending? It should be he walk, right? If you were to say that to someone, it would make sense. We know what you're saying. It's not grammatically correct, but it is kind of an odd little leftover that still exists in English today. So don't freak out about changing the ending of the verb. Again, you know how to do this. You probably never thought about it, but you do. Bonus fun fact for you, right? That you didn't think you were getting two of them in this video. If you know other languages, they do this, right? So particularly the Romance languages. If you know French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, right, Romanian, if you know other languages that do this, you might have a leg up, right? So in particular, French and Spanish are kind of really common ones, Italian too, in American high schools. You're learning about this if you're studying them at the same time as Latin. So if you already know this, this will be kind of easy, right? The idea of changing the ending of a verb, depending on who's doing it, makes sense. If you don't know another language, I would encourage you to go learn one, right? Take your Latin skills and go learn one of the Romance languages. It'll be pretty straightforward for you, hopefully a little bit easier. And you'll have a leg up, right? Because when it comes time to, day one of Spanish and they talk about changing the ending of a verb, you're going to recognize that and be comfortable with it and understand like, oh yeah, got it. I changed the verb ending and I changed who the subject was. That's what we're getting at here. So it is an important skill and one that has different uses, particularly if you go into learning more languages, which I highly recommend that you do. So here are the verb endings, right? They change. And we've been saying this, Latin verb endings change. So the tense and the voice, we talked about that. The verb is going to change depending on the tense, voice, and mood that you use. Don't get confused. We'll deal with that in another video, but just know that, there's more things than just changing the ending. There's different ways you can change it, rather. That's how I should say it. There's different ways you change it depending on what you're saying with your verb. So there's a bunch of pieces. We'll take them one at a time. Don't freak out. Here's the other thing you want to know, though, the basic starter kit. So let's deal with present tense active voice. This is the most basic form of a verb you can really do in Latin, right? The basic starter kit is this. The endings are O, and notice how it's a long O. O-S-T, M-U-S-T-I-S-N-T. These are the ones you got to memorize. So what do they mean? Well, they represent different pronouns, right? So O means I'm doing the action. S means you. T means he, she, or it is doing the action. M-U-S means we. T-I-S, most textbooks write you all. Sometimes I'll write y'all, or if you're my Italian grandmother, yous, right? Yous, another good one. It all means you all. It's kind of what it is, that you plural. And the NT means they, right? So if you see a verb in Latin and it has a specific ending, you know who's doing that verb, right? Who the subject is. So here's an example, right? The verb to walk, present tense. You'd say ambulo, I walk. If I change it to ambulas, now I'm saying you are walking or you walk. Ambulat is he, she, or it walks. Ambulamus means we, ambulatus means you all, and ambulant means they walk, right? So I highlighted it here in yellow so you can see it. By changing the ending of the verb, I'm changing who the subject is. So the trick about Latin is this, and I guess this is bonus fun fact number 3 for you. You don't actually need subjects all the time, right? You don't really need pronouns. Sometimes you don't even really need to write out a subject, right? If you see my other video, that nominative case noun is what I'm talking about, because you know that the ending of the verb is telling you who the subject is. So in other words, I don't need to say ego ambulo, I walk. I don't need the ego, right? Just ambulo means I walk. So this is where Latin is much more condensed and sort of tighter, if that makes sense, than English. One word in Latin represents 2 in English. In English, you need that pronoun, right? That's what we said was the key difference earlier on in the video. You need that pronoun to say I, you, he, she, it, or maybe just a regular noun in third person, or if you're saying the dog or the boy or the girl, whatever, right? You need something to tell you who the subject is. You really don't need that in Latin. The same rule applies, though, in the third person, so the he, she, it, and they. That's where you really see a lot of subjects in Latin, because otherwise you're not going to know what's going on in the sentence. But the rest of them, right? So ambulo, ambulas, ambulamus, ambulatus, you don't really need a subject going with it, right? Or a pronoun, rather. We know what the subject is because of the verb ending. So it's a little tricky of an idea, but it's one that once you get the hang of it, this will make sense forever, right? But it's a key part of the language, so you want to make sure that you really lock this idea down, that if I change the spelling of my verb, I'm changing who's doing the action. That's a really important idea that you got to get early on in your Latin career. So a little quick note for you, something to pay attention to. You got to really pay attention to spelling, right? I've been saying this the whole time, but it's the key idea. Pay attention to spelling, because if you change the spelling, you're changing the meaning, right? So in Latin, it's kind of different. In English, if you said I walks, right? people would understand what you mean. It's not grammatically correct, but we get it. In Latin, if you change a verb ending around and instead of saying ambulo, I'm walking, you say ambulas, right? That completely changed the meaning around. You can't really fudge it and be like, oh man, I only added one letter. It's just a slight mistake. It does matter because those letters make a huge difference in who's doing the action. So pay close attention as you're reading Latin. If you're writing it, whatever you're doing, pay really close attention to how these verbs are spelled. That's the whole idea. So let's just do a quick recap as we end this video, right? Verbs are action words. Make sure you know that, okay? And it's not just physical actions. It could be mental, it could be a state or a condition, but in general, they are action words. It's kind of the general definition of them. In Latin, the spelling of the verb's ending indicates the subject. It also indicates the tense and the mood, but the subject is really the idea. The voice, too, is another one that does. But it's telling you who's doing the action. That's what we want for this video, right? Change the ending, you're changing who's doing the action. There's a lot you can learn about verb endings. There's a lot more to come, so really, stay tuned, pay attention. But once you dive into things like tense, mood, voice, this is where we really get a lot of different verb endings happening. So it's important that in this video, and again, you should watch this at the very start of your Latin career, it's important that you're just getting the general idea, the basics. If you change the ending of a verb, you're changing the meaning. That's what you want to leave this video with.